Caution. The AJ and Quill Show contains D&D content and is intended for a D&D audience. And, besides that, they're really weird. From 1983 to 1985, across 27 episodes, Dungeons & Dragons the animated series followed the adventures of 6 friends who thought they were taking an innocent trip on the Dungeons & Dragons ride. Halfway through the tunnel, they are magically transported Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe style to the world of Dungeons & Dragons, where they will spend the rest of their lives trying to find a way home. Upon arrival in D&D land, they are greeted by their soon-to-be arch-nemesis, Venger, as well as Tiamat the Five-Headed Dragon, Uni the Unicorn, and their host and guide, Dungeon Master. Each of the 6 friends is given a character class from the 2nd edition AD&D book and a signature weapon. Hank the Ranger with a magical bow, Eric the Cavalier with a shield, Diana the Acrobat with a magical bow staff, Arthur, also known as Presto the Wizard with a magical hat, Sheila the Thief with a cloak of invisibility, you're welcome Harry, and Bobby, her little brother, as a barbarian with a magical log that he calls a club. Tasked by Dungeon Master with not only finding their way home, but also fighting against the evil Venger and the forces of darkness at his command. All of this and more is set up masterfully during the opening credits of this show. A star-studded voice cast including the iconic Peter Optimus Prime Cullen and Frank Megatron Welker, a sentence that basically writes itself anytime an 80s animated series is ever mentioned. The cartoon showed that Dungeons & Dragons could be mainstream entertainment at the same level as Marvel, DC, and Disney. Ultimately, the show was a brilliant PR move to put a new public face on the reputation of Dungeons & Dragons post-Satanic Panic. The cartoon, more than anything else, is responsible for softening the image of Dungeons & Dragons for fun and including a lot of the language from the game into the common vernacular of any household. It helped pave the way for hundreds of movies, actual play shows, and even new animated series. And it made Dungeons & Dragons no longer a thing to be whispered about in the same context that includes suicides and satanic rituals. It was a show on Saturday morning about adventure, friendship, and hope. With Wizards of the Coast bringing Dungeons & Dragons into its next phase, we decided to do a series of videos covering the characters from the animated series. Now, the characters were created during the AD&D or 2nd edition era, and we do have official stats for them right here. D&D did an updated printing of these characters in 3rd edition. Now, we're going to use these stats as inspiration, but translating characters across editions can be really tricky. Rules and game mechanics change across the editions. You can just ask Chris Perkins when he created 5e stats for everybody's favorite ranger, Dritz. Some people complained online because he made him a fighter in 5th edition, even though he's known as a ranger. A lot of people were getting hung up on the word ranger. In the books he's called a ranger, but that's really more of an occupation, not a class. In 5e, he's better represented as a fighter with the Outlander background if you were going to make him a character. Today we're covering Hank the Ranger. Hank is the oldest among the kids. He acts as their default leader throughout their adventures in the realms. Self-disciplined and dependable, Hank leads because the others respect his judgment, not because he's bossy or imperious. Hank's greatest fear is that he'll do something to lose the respect of his friends and thus lose their friendship. Now, it seems pretty obvious what class Hank the Ranger should be, but not actually. You see, back in 2nd edition, the Ranger was part of the warrior group, same as the fighter and the paladin. But like Dritz, in 5th edition, the Ranger class doesn't really explain how Hank behaves in the show, at least not during combat. Hank mechanically is a fighter, and for this subclass we've chosen the underappreciated Arcane Archer subclass. But first, let's cover his weapon. Hank has the energy bow given to him by Dungeon Master. Now you can see this same energy bow creep across multiple media. 3rd edition gave stats for the weapon, but in 5th edition I think it's better described as a dragon wing longbow from Fizzbands. It's almost like the designers in D&D did this deliberately when they were writing Fizzbands. Now these bows are infused with the magical essence of a dragon for their extra damage. And for Hank's bow, it looks like it's dealing radiant damage, which probably means it came from a crystal dragon. Now his class, the Arcane Archer. Fighters are really versatile in this game. They can fill a number of combat roles pretty easily depending on how you build them. And even though Hank is the leader of this group, he isn't the tank. A lot of people get that confused. Hank in combat is going to work like a sniper. He's going to lead from the back. Now for their stats, we're going to use the standard array just because everybody knows what that is. For his species, all the children are going to be human variant because feats are cool. If you don't use the optional feat rule, then just make them a regular human. But you should use the optional feat rule because they're cool. Now as a sniper, Hank is going to rely on his dexterity for both offense and defense while staying out of melee combat and behind as much cover as possible. Usually we would say snipers have a high wisdom as well. This kind of gives them a little bit of protection against spells, but also helps them use their perception so they can spot opponents that are trying to hide in combat. But Arcane archers need to swap this for intelligence because a lot of their abilities rely on it. So for role-playing, they would favor more investigation to accomplish things that other characters would use perception for. It's just a different way of doing the same thing. Now snipers are long-ranged, stationary, ranged weapon users that protect themselves by avoiding damage. Now we say long range, but what does that really mean? Well, long range means between 30 feet and the maximum normal range of their weapon. Now, even though Hank is the leader, he's going to lead from the rear, calling out directions to the other kids. At the start of combat, Hank should position himself at long range. Now that means between 30 feet and the maximum normal range of his longbow, and behind as much cover as possible with a view of as much of the battlefield as possible. This vantage gives Hank a clear picture of combat and makes it easier for him to call out directions to the other kids. Now snipers should wear the best armor they can get their hands on, but keep in mind that they have lower strength. And they're also going to want to use stealth themselves, which means their dexterity is going to be high. So armor like studded leather would be ideal, or any heavier armor that doesn't interfere with stealth checks. Hank in the artwork is clearly wearing studded leather. Now from long range and cover, snipers deal direct damage into the bulk of melee fighting. Now that's where the tank is going to be. Snipers can also pick off key opponents behind the front line of combat, like enemy healers or spellcasters that are causing major problems for their allies. Now the problem with ranged combat is that even your own allies can provide cover for your enemies. The sharpshooter feat takes care of this problem, so it's the feat Hank is going to pick for his variant human feat. Now, speaking of sharpshooter, it also lets you take a -5 from your attack and add +10 to your damage. The 3.5 edition version of this energy bow did something similar, but it was from the bow itself, not the actual character. Now you might be wondering, when do I take that -5 penalty for the extra damage? When is it worth it? Luckily, we can answer all of this with the amazing power of math. Now we're not going to bore you with all the calculations behind the scenes, but here's the formula. Basically, you subtract half the average damage of your weapon from 16 and add your attack modifier. Now you remember this number because it's going to change as you level up. Now if you believe the target's armor class is less than that number, then you should take this penalty. Now if you have advantage on your attack roll, then you should take this penalty if you believe that the target's armor class is lower than or equal to 14 plus your attack modifier. Now if you have disadvantage on your attack, or if you believe that you could kill the target with enough damage from a regular attack, never ever take this penalty because it's not worth it. Now at second level, fighters get Action Surge. This lets them take one additional action on their turn and it refreshes on a short rest. In general, do not save this ability. Use it at the start of every combat. We say this because the average adventuring day was designed around 6 encounters with 2 short rests in between your long rests. This means that you should probably plan to use Action Surge a minimum of once every 2 encounters. But here's the funny thing. The game designers did a survey and found that the actual number of encounters between any rests is exactly 1. Now what does all this mean? The 6 encounters per day is really more indicative of a heavy combat dungeon crawl. If you're in one of those, then you should Action Surge once every 2 encounters. At 9th level, fighters get Indomitable. This lets you re-roll a failed saving throw once per long rest. Do not save this ability. The first time you fail a saving throw, you should absolutely use this ability. Players tend to hold on to items and abilities just in case something happens, but they end up never using them. Don't be that person. As a standing decision, use Indomitable whenever you fail a save and you have it available, period. Now the other subclass features from the Arcane Archer are great, but they aren't going to change Hank's combat tactics. Magic Arrow at 7th level helps overcome immunities that start appearing around then. And Curving Shot is kind of a failsafe for a miss, and it's good as long as you have a bonus action to use it. Ever Ready Shot at 15th level helps those combat heavy days where you may not get a chance to have a rest in between as much as you would want. But here's the important part, Arcane Shots. Now, kind of like a magical battle master, Arcane archers can perform these spectacular tricks with their arrows. That's why we chose this for Hank. In the show, he does some amazingly unusual and fantastical feats with these magical arrows. We thought this would represent it best. Now, each of these arcane shots is associated with a different school of magic, and it can be used twice per rest. Now, if you want a little bit of a homebrew, many people complain about this not being enough. And even though the arcane shots are slightly more powerful than the Battle Master's maneuvers, they feel like you don't get enough. Now, in keeping with how D&D has been doing things lately, a fair homebrew might be so that they could use their arcane shots a proficiency time bonus per rest. That would limit this ability while allowing it to increase as the character levels. But this is ultimately a homebrew, you can choose to do this or not. Talk to your DM. Now here's how you use the various arcane shot options. We're going to call these standing decisions. These are decisions you make before combat so that you know when to use something. You just have these all planned out so you don't have to think on the fly. Now these standing decisions will tell you when you're going to use each one of these different arrows. Banishing Arrow comes from the Abjuration school of magic. Now this is crowd control. It makes the enemy go away for a little while. It targets your charisma, so avoid enemies that have high charisma. Use it to make the battle easier or to allow your party to run away. Beguiling Arrow. This comes from the Enchantment school. It's very Cupid's arrow in its feel, but the damage plus charm combination is pretty weird when you think about it. You're hitting them and they love you. Now this would be a great way to compel an enemy to surrender or to keep enemies in melee combat from attacking you. Other than that, we can't really find a use for it. Bursting Arrow. Now this is an arrow enchanted with evocation magic. It's basically fireball on a stick. In the Baldur's Gate game, there were arrows of detonation that kind of had this effect. Now this arrow has an area of effect, and if you look at the targets in area effect table inside the DMG, you see you're going to want to try to get at least 3 targets in the area of effect for this arrow. Otherwise, it's not really worth using it. Enfeebling Arrow. This is the necromantic magic arrow. It's weird. It's great for reducing the damage on heavy hitters, but it's dependent on a failed constitution save, which those big heavy hitter brute type enemies usually have in spades. Try to aim for fast moving rogues or high dexterity companions that tend to have lower constitutions. Grasping Arrow. Now this is your conjuration arrow. Targets the enemy's strength and it both slows movement and causes damage if they move. Now this can do a ton of damage, so use it against important enemies, not lowly minions. And honestly, this is a prime contender for the very first arrow you would even choose. Piercing Arrow. This is your transmutation arrow. It's a railgun that goes through walls. It nails every enemy in a 30-foot straight line from you. It targets an area of effect. If we go back to the targets and area effect table, you can see that you're going to want to get at least 2 enemies with this, which isn't even hard, honestly. This ignores cover and armor, and it targets a dex save, so aiming for big, heavily armored enemies or enemy support casters and healers is what you're going to want to hit. Seeking Arrow. Now this is your divination enchanted arrow. This shoots an arrow that will magically go and try and find your enemies. It shoots at targets that are invisible, fleeing, behind cover, or in a completely different room. Shadow Arrow. This is the arrow enchanted with illusion magic. It limits the target's vision to 5 feet, after which they're essentially blinded, which is great for range, because you'll get advantage on the attack against them. But it can also give them tunnel vision if they're in melee range with, say, your tank, and makes it so they'll only want to attack the tank, because that's all they can see. This is kind of like a ranged taunt for your allies in a way. If you target someone engaged with the tank, they will only be able to see the tank. If you target enemy spellcasters and snipers, they won't be able to see you and they'll end up having to run into melee range to do anything. Plus, anyone outside their reduced vision range gets advantage on their attacks for being an unseen attacker. And that's it. This is all you're going to need for Hank the Ranger / Arcane Archer. Now you don't have to make Hank an Arcane Archer like we did here. You could easily make him a Hunter Ranger, and here's the neat part. His tactics don't change. He fights exactly the same way as a Sniper Ranger or a Sniper Fighter. Whether he's a ranger or an arcane archer, Hank is going to stay at range, behind cover, shooting arrows into melee combat, taking out enemies. And he's going to try to avoid as much damage as possible. It doesn't make a difference, so feel free to play with this as much as you like. Now we hope you have as much fun using Tank as we did in making him. And we'll see you next time. Bye!